The dish on the cover of every magazine. The one that built Grant Beaumont an empire of restaurants and a television show and a line of frozen dinners in every grocery store in this country, is my late wife's. He calls it the Beaumont Gumbo. The whole world calls it the Beaumont Gumbo. He has accepted 3 awards for it, written about the night it supposedly came to him in a dream, and built a $40 million company on it. And in all those years, across all that money, the one thing Grant Beaumont has never once said, because he does not know it, and never bothered to learn it, is the name of the woman who actually made it. Her name was Cécile. It was her grandmother's pot, and her hands, and her grief, and mine. And Grant Beaumont does not know she existed. He knew me, though that was the part that should have made it impossible, and did not. To Grant Beaumont, on the day he stood on a festival stage in front of 1,000 people and a wall of cameras and called me a sad, confused old man who needed to stop telling lies about a great chef's life's work. I was a washed-up line cook with delusions, a nobody who had wandered in off the street to ride his coattails. He did not seem to recognize that the washed-up line cook had taught him to hold a knife. He did not seem to remember the 3 years he spent in my kitchen learning everything he has ever known about food, or the afternoon he drove away with a box of my wife's recipes in his trunk and never came back, or that the dream he tells reporters about is a dying woman's last good week, which he was not even there for. By the end of that festival, 1,000 people and every one of those cameras were going to taste the difference between what Grant Beaumont sells and what Cécile made. And they were going to learn her name. This is the story of a man who stole the most sacred thing another man ever made, and the afternoon the theft finally cooked itself in front of everyone in her grandmother's pot. My name is Theo Landry. I am 55 years old, and I cook at a lunch counter in New Orleans that seats 14 people and loses money most weeks. A narrow little room with a screen door and a ceiling fan and a hand-lettered board, where I make a plate lunch for working folks and old folks and anyone who comes in hungry and short, and I do not turn the short ones away, which is part of why we lose money, and I have made my peace with that. I am, by every measure the world keeps, a failure. I gave away the thing that could have made me rich, and the man I gave it to is rich, and I cook plate lunches for 14 people, and if you saw me wiping down the counter, you would file me where Grant Beaumont filed me, under nobody. And you would not be wrong about the money, and you would not know the first true thing about me. Most people have made something, at least once, that mattered, and watched somebody else get the credit for it. A report you wrote that your boss presented as his own, an idea you gave away in a meeting that someone louder repeated and got praised for. When that happens, it leaves a specific quiet in a person, one that does not go away, that you simply learn to carry around like a stone in a coat pocket. You and I are going to stand in that quiet together for a while, and then, I promise, we are going to walk back out of it. Stay with me. There is something at the end of this about what can actually be stolen and what cannot, that took me 30 years and a dying woman to learn, and I would like to save you the 30 years. But you cannot understand the festival until you understand Cécile and the pot. So let me take you back, because she is the whole of it, and she always was. I met Cécile when we were both young and both poor and both cooking in other people's kitchens. And we fell in love over a shared conviction that the food we had grown up on, the food of poor black and Creole families in South Louisiana, the food made out of the cheap cuts and the long hours and the things other people threw away, was as fine and as serious as anything served in any white tablecloth dining room in the world, and that nobody was treating it that way, and that we were going to. So we scraped together nothing, and we opened a little room, smaller than the one I cook in now, and Cécile cooked the food of her grandmother and her great-grandmother, who had cooked it on plantations they were not free to leave. And I learned at her elbow that there is a kind of genius that never gets called genius, because it wears an apron and answers to grandmother. And she was that genius. And I was lucky enough to spend 20 years standing next to it. I want you to see her for a second, because the world only ever knew the dish and never knew her. And that is the whole crime. Really, bigger than the money. She was not a soft woman. People hear a story like this and picture some gentle grandmother, and Cécile was not that. She was sharp and funny and exacting, and she would send a plate back to her own stove if the rice was a minute wrong. And she cooked angry sometimes, and tired. And she taught me that the food does not care how you feel. It only cares whether you are paying attention. And that paying attention when you do not feel like it is most of what love turns out to be. She believed, with her whole stubborn heart, that the food her people had made out of scarcity and grief was not lesser, not peasant food, not a quaint regional curiosity, but one of the great cuisines of the world that had simply never been allowed a tablecloth. And she cooked every plate like she was arguing it to a judge who had already ruled against her, which, it turned out, was exactly what she was doing. She did not live to see anyone agree with her. That is the part I cannot forgive. Not the theft, the timing of it. That she died still being told her life's work was a footnote, while the man who is now agreed with, who is called the great preserver of the cuisine, learned every word of the argument from her, and then signed his own name to it. The Gumbo, the one the world calls his, came at the end. Cécile got sick, the kind of sick that has a calendar on it, and in her last good year she set out to put down on paper the dishes her family had carried for 150 years and never written, because they had never been allowed the luxury of believing their food was worth writing down. And the gumbo was the heart of it. It was not a recipe, exactly. It was a way of doing a thing that her grandmother had done and her grandmother before her. A roux taken darker and slower than sense allows, to the very edge of burning, where it stops being a thickener and becomes a kind of grief made edible, smoky and bitter and deep. And Cécile told me, stirring it in her grandmother's black cast-iron pot the last winter she was strong enough to stand at a stove, that you could not learn it from the measurements, that the measurements were a lie people told to feel safe, that you learned it from the pot and the spoon and the smell, and from being willing to stand at the edge of ruining it for 45 minutes without flinching, which she said was also more or less how you loved somebody. She made that gumbo for me the week before she could no longer cook at all. It is the last thing she ever made with her own hands. I have her pot. It is the most valuable object on this earth, and it is worth, as scrap, about $9. Grant Beaumont came to us in the middle of all that. He was young, hungry, talented in the way that turns out to be the least important kind of talented, and he wanted to learn, and we taught him. Because that is what you do, you pass it on. Cécile believed that to her bones. He was in our kitchen for 3 years. He was there for most of Cécile's last year, watched her teach the dishes onto paper, watched her stir that roux to the edge of black, took notes. I should be fair to the young man he was, because the lie is easier if I make him a villain from the start. And he was not one, or not only one. He had real ability and real hunger, and he worked harder than anyone I ever trained. And Cécile was fond of him, which is the part that still costs me. But I saw, even then, the thing in him that would one day become the whole of him, which was that he wanted the result without the cost, the applause without the 45 minutes at the edge of ruin. He learned the motions of the roux perfectly, and never once, in 3 years, learned to stand inside the fear of it, because the fear was the price. And Grant Beaumont was a man who had decided very young that prices were for other people. He would pull the pot a minute early, every time, to be safe, and the gumbo would be good, very good, better than almost anyone's. And Cécile would taste it and say nothing, because she had worked out, before I had, But the boy was missing the one thing that cannot be taught to a person unwilling to be afraid, and that no amount of talent ever closes that gap, and that he would go a very long way on the exact thing that would keep him, forever, just short of the real one. She was right. She was always right. He went about as far as a man can go on precisely that. And when she died, in the worst and emptiest week of my life, when I could not cook and could barely stand, Grant Beaumont came to the restaurant, and he was kind to me. I will give him that. He was kind for exactly as long as it took to ask if he could borrow Cécile's recipe book to make copies, for safekeeping, he said, so her work would not be lost. I was grieving and grateful, and I said yes. He drove away with 150 years of her family in a cardboard box, and I did not see him again until I saw his face on a billboard. The years after were lawyers I could not afford, and a contract he had been clever enough to get me to sign during those 3 years, and that I had never read because I trusted him. And the slow understanding that a poor old widower with a 14-seat counter does not beat a rising star with money and a firm. And the dawning of the fact that the law protects the man who writes things down and files them, not the woman who carried a thing in her hands for a lifetime and never once thought to claim what was already, obviously, hers. I lost. There was never a version where I won, because the world had already decided, long before Grant Beaumont, that Cécile's kind of genius did not count as the kind you can own. So I stopped. Not because I forgave it, because fighting it meant dragging Cécile through depositions and headlines, turning the last sacred thing she made into a legal exhibit. And I would not do that to her, dead or alive. And Grant Beaumont was counting on exactly that. On a grieving man's dignity being more expensive to him than the truth was worth. He read me correctly. He usually does. It is the one thing he is truly good at. So he took the gumbo, and he sanded it down. That is the part that, for a long time, hurt worse than the theft. He took Cécile's roux, the one you carry to the edge of ruin, and he made it safe, made it consistent, made it something a line cook in 100 franchises could hit every time. And in doing so, he took out the exact thing that made it hers. The grief in it, the willingness to stand at the edge, and he sold the safe version to the whole country and called it the finest expression of the cuisine. And the whole country, never having tasted the real thing, believed him. He won every award her dish could win. For a version of it she would not have served to an enemy. Which brings us to the festival. It is the biggest food festival in the South, and it had decided, that year, to honor the regional traditions, and somebody on the committee with a long memory and a guilty conscience had reached out to me, quietly, and invited the little 14-seat counter to set up a booth among the famous names, as a nod to the old ways, the authentic stuff, the roots. I almost did not go. I went because of Marcel. Marcel is 18. He showed up at my counter 2 years ago needing a job and not knowing a roux from a roof. A quick, watchful, proud kid from a hard block who reminded me, in the way he held himself, of the boy I had been. And I started teaching him, the real way, the way Cécile taught me, with the pot and the spoon and no measurements. And the child has it, the genius that wears an apron. And I had decided he was going to carry what Cécile carried, because somebody had to, and the empire sure was not going to. Marcel had never seen me cook for anyone but the lunch crowd. He did not entirely believe my stories about the famous chef and the stolen gumbo. I could tell. He loved me, but he half thought I was an old man polishing a grievance. And some part of why I let him drag me to that festival was that I wanted the boy to see, just once, that the old man at the 14-seat counter had not always been nobody. The day I knew Marcel had it, he had been with me about 6 months, and we were closing up. And I had a pot of Cécile's gumbo going for the staff meal, and I got called to the front. And when I came back, The boy was standing at the stove with the spoon, not stirring, just watching. And the roux was right at the edge, right at the line where 1 more minute makes it perfect and 90 more seconds ruins the whole thing. A kid who did not have it would have pulled it early to be safe, the way young Grant always did. A reckless kid would have pushed it too far to look brave. Marcel just stood there, dead still, sweating, trusting his nose over his nerves for what felt like a year. And then he pulled it at the exact half second, and he looked up at me, terrified he had ruined it. And it was perfect. And I had to turn around and pretend to look for something so the boy would not see what my face was doing. Because that, the willingness to stand in the fear and not flinch, is the whole of it. And you cannot teach it. You can only recognize it. And I had not seen it in a living soul since Cécile. And here it was, in an 18-year-old who had walked into a 14-seat counter looking for a job. I knew right then that he was going to carry her, and that the empire, with all its money, did not have one single person who could. We set up our humble booth, a folding table and 2 burners and Cécile's pot, between a celebrity barbecue man and a famous bakery, and we made her gumbo, the real one, the dark and dangerous one, and a small crowd gathered the way a crowd gathers around the one booth that smells like the truth. And for an hour, it was the best afternoon I had had in years. Watching Marcel ladle out Cécile's gumbo to strangers and watching their faces change. And then Grant Beaumont's entourage came down the row, cameras and all, because he was the festival's headliner, and he was being filmed, walking the booths, being gracious to the little people. And he stopped at ours, because the crowd around it was the biggest on the row, and a man like Grant Beaumont cannot abide a crowd he is not the center of. He looked at the pot, he looked at me, and I watched him decide not to recognize me, which is a different thing from not recognizing me. And he turned to his cameras and his crowd, and he made me his entertainment. He asked, smiling, what we were serving. And when a bystander said, before I could, that it was the best gumbo they had ever had, better than Beaumont's, the smile tightened, and Grant Beaumont did the thing that men like him do when the ground moves under them, which is attack. He told the crowd, warmly, sadly, that he hated to say it, but this was a sad and common thing in his world. That real success attracts people who claim they invented your work. That he had been told this poor old man had been going around for years saying he was the true author of the Beaumont Gumbo, and that while he had compassion for the confusion of the elderly, there were limits, and that everyone should enjoy the imitation but remember where the original came from. He said imitation, looking right at Cécile's pot. He kept going, the way they always keep going, 1 beat too long, because the applause is a drug and he could feel it slipping. He picked up the lid of Cécile's pot, her grandmother's pot, the black iron that had cooked for 5 generations of one family, and he turned it over in his hands in front of the cameras like an appraiser examining a forgery. And he said, with a little laugh for the crowd, that he supposed every great tradition spawned its imitators with their colorful old props. And he set the lid back down a little too hard. And the sound of it, her pot lid ringing in his hand, was the thing that nearly broke me. More than any word he said, because he did not even know what he was holding. He had taken notes in the room where that pot was teaching a dying woman's hands what to do. And 30 years later, he could pick it up and call it a colorful old prop. And that, the not knowing, the blank ignorance of the sacred thing in his own 2 hands, was somehow worse than if he had known and sneered. You can fight a man who knows what he is desecrating. There is nothing to say to a man who genuinely cannot tell. He said it to humiliate me, in front of the boy, in front of the cameras, and it worked. The crowd's warmth toward our booth curdled into the embarrassed pity people feel for a deluded old man. And I watched Marcel's face. The boy who had finally been believing it start to crumble. And I felt the thing come up in me that I had kept down for 30 years. I had it, right there, the whole of it, ready to throw. I could have told that crowd and those cameras everything. The 3 years in my kitchen, the box of recipes, the contract, Cécile dying while he took notes, the name he does not know. I wanted to take Grant Beaumont's borrowed crown and break it over the folding table in front of his own cameras. The grief and the 30 years rose up together, and they wanted blood. What kept my mouth shut was the pot. Because that festival was not the place to win an argument about the past, and a shouting match between a famous man and an old one ends only one way in the eyes of a crowd, with the old one looking exactly as crazy as the famous one just said he was. Words were Grant Beaumont's weapon, not mine. He could out-talk me in front of any crowd in the world. He had been out-talking everyone his whole career. That was the entire skill. But there was one thing Grant Beaumont had never actually been able to do, only fake. And it happened to be the only thing I had left. And a pot of gumbo does not lie and cannot be out-talked. So I did not argue. I picked up Cécile's spoon, and I said the only thing I said to him the whole afternoon, which was, quietly, that I would not argue with him, but that the festival had 2 pots of gumbo on this row, his and mine, and that I was content to let anyone who cared to settle which was which with their own mouth, and that I would be right here. It was Marcel, God love him, who made it a moment, because the boy was braver than the old man. He turned to the cameras, this 18-year-old, shaking, and he said, loud so it carried, that there was a famous food critic at this very festival, the one whose name even I knew, a woman who had been eating the best food in the world for 40 years and could not be bought or fooled, and that she should taste both gumbos, Beaumont's and ours, side by side, blind, no labels, and tell the cameras which one was the real Louisiana. And let that be the end of it. The crowd, which loves nothing on this earth like a contest, took it up, and it grew, and within minutes it was happening, because Grant Beaumont could not refuse it without admitting he was afraid of it. And Grant Beaumont had spent 30 years being certain that no one could ever tell, that the safe version was good enough. That the difference Cécile lived and died for was a thing only Cécile could taste, and she was gone. They brought the critic. They gave her 2 unmarked bowls. The cameras came in close, and the festival went quiet. 1,000 people quiet. And she tasted his first, the safe one, the famous one. And she nodded, professional, complimentary, said the things you say. And then she tasted Cécile's. And I watched a woman who had eaten everything there is to eat in this world go still, and then go somewhere else. Somewhere back, the way a taste takes you back. And her eyes filled, and she set the spoon down, and into all that quiet she said that she did not know who had made the second bowl, but that it was the real thing. The thing the first bowl was a careful and lifeless copy of. That the second bowl had something in it the first one had clearly had once and lost. And that whoever cooked it had not learned it from a recipe. You could taste that it had come down through hands, and that it was, she said, and her voice broke a little, the best gumbo she had eaten in 40 years of eating gumbo. And she wanted to know whose it was. And Marcel, before I could stop him, before I could even think, the boy pointed at me and said her name. He had heard me say it 10,000 times. He said, "It is Cécile Landry's." He learned it from him, Theo. And the cameras turned, all of them, from the famous man to the old one, and 1,000 people turned with them. And for the first time in 30 years, in front of the whole world that had been eating his lie, somebody said Cécile's name out loud in the place where it belonged, attached to the things she made. Grant Beaumont was not destroyed. Exactly. The truth is stranger than that, and in the end, sadder. He did not bluster. He had no words for once. which for him was a kind of death all its own. He stood there while the critic and the crowd and the cameras worked out, in real time, what they had just tasted and what it meant. And his face did a thing I had not expected and have not forgotten. Because what came up in it, under the panic, was something almost like relief. And I understood Grant Beaumont then, finally, after 30 years of hating him, in a way that took the worst of the hate out of me. The man had been afraid of that bowl for 30 years. He had built an empire on a thing he could not make, had stood in his own test kitchens for 3 decades, trying to get the safe version to taste like the one he remembered from my kitchen, and never could. Because the thing he was missing was never in the box he stole. It was in Cécile's grief and Cécile's pot, and a love he was never part of, and he knew it. He had always known it. Every award was a fresh terror that this exact afternoon would someday come, and now it had come, and the waiting was over. He was not a man who had gotten away with it. He was a man who had been getting away with it every single day for 30 years, which is a different and more exhausting sentence. And the look on his face when it finally caught him was, I swear to you, partly grateful. The way a fugitive is grateful to be finally, simply caught. I did not press it. The crowd would have torn him to pieces if I had pointed them, and the law might even have moved, late, the way it does, but I did not come to that festival to destroy Grant Beaumont. And standing there with Cécile's pot and Cécile's name finally spoken, I found I did not want to. Destroying him would have made the day about him again, and the day, at last, after 30 years, was about her. So I did the thing she would have done, because she was a better person than I will ever be. I told the critic and the cameras the truth, plainly, no venom, that the gumbo was Cécile Landry's, that it came down through her grandmother's hands and her grandmother's before that I had only ever been its keeper, and that the young man beside me was its future. I did not say the word stolen. I did not have to. The empty space where I did not say it was louder than the word would have been. And every person there filled it in for themselves, which is its own kind of justice. The kind that does not require you to lift the knife yourself. Here is what happened after, the part I care about. The food world is not as just as a story wants it to be, and Grant Beaumont still has his company and his frozen dinners, because $40 million empires do not fall in an afternoon, whatever the crowd feels. But something did fall that day, and it was the thing he had spent 30 years and a fortune protecting, which was the belief, his own belief, that he was the author of his own life. That is gone now. He cannot get it back. He will sell Gumbo until he dies, and he will know, every single day, in a way the whole world now half knows too, that it was never his. And there is no court that could have sentenced him more completely than that. Cécile got her name back. The Critic wrote about it, and other people wrote about it. And there are food historians now, serious ones, who have started saying Cécile Landry's name in the same breath as the cuisine she gave her life to. And a young chef or two has made the pilgrimage to a 14-seat counter to taste the real roux and learn where the thing actually came from. And that, the name surviving, mattering, being said, is the only award I ever wanted, and it is hers, not mine. A young woman came into the counter a few months ago, a cook from up north, and she had read about Cécile, and she ordered the gumbo and ate it slowly and then asked me, shy, whether she could just see the pot. Not touch it, see it. And I brought it out and set it on the counter between us, this $9 piece of scrap iron. And she looked at it the way people look at things in cathedrals, and she said, "Thank you for keeping it." And she did not mean the pot. I have thought about that more than I have thought about any award Grant Beaumont ever won. A stranger crossed half the country to say thank you to a dead woman, by name, over a bowl of gumbo. And there is no magazine cover on earth worth as much as that. Cécile, who spent her whole life being told her food was a footnote, has people making pilgrimages now, Late, but not too late to matter, because the dead are not as far off as people think. And I tell her about every single one of them. And Marcel is the answer to the only question that ever kept me up at night, which was, who would carry it when I am gone? Now that the Empire has only the safe, dead version, Marcel will carry it. He has Cécile's Gumbo in his hands now, the real one, the dangerous one. And he is going to cook it at the edge of ruin for the next 50 years and teach it to some watchful, proud kid of his own someday, with no measurements, the way it has always been taught, hand to hand. And that line, the real one, runs straight through a 14-seat counter and not through a single one of Grant Beaumont's $40 million. I am keeping Cécile's pot. It is not going to a museum, and it is not going to Grant Beaumont's lawyers, and it is not even going to Marcel. Not yet. Because Marcel needs to season his own pot over his own years, the way she did, the way I did. Since the secret was never the pot anyway. The pot is just iron. The secret is the standing at the edge and not flinching for 45 minutes. Which is also, she told me, how you love somebody. He has that already. He got it from me. I got it from her. You cannot put it in a box and drive away with it. He tried. He found that out, in the end, in front of everybody. I promised you, back at the start, a thing about what can be stolen and what cannot. And here it is, paid for with 30 years of watching a man wear my wife's life like a borrowed coat. They can take the credit. They can take the money, the awards, the magazine covers, the name in lights, all of it. And the law will help them do it. And it will feel, for a long time, like they took the thing itself. But they did not take the thing itself. Because the thing itself was never the recipe or the credit or the money. It was the love that went into the making and the skill in your own two hands. And those stay with you. They cannot be filed or franchised or sold. And you can make the thing again tomorrow. And they never can. Not really. Not the true version. Because they do not have what it was made out of. So if somebody has taken credit for the best thing you ever made, I want you to hear this from a man who lost the biggest case of credit theft you will ever hear about. And won the only part that mattered. Go make another one. The credit was never the treasure. The treasure is that you are the one who can. Tell me in the comments about something you made that somebody else took the bow for, and then tell me what you are going to make next. I read every one. And somewhere tonight, stir something to the edge of ruin, and do not flinch. For somebody you love. That is the whole recipe. It is the only one she ever really left me, and nobody, in 30 years, has figured out how to steal it.